Our last segment is actually pretty fascinating. Members from the DEA. I saw part of this presentation in July. It's a pretty amazing presentation, pretty extensive. So because of that, I'm just going to go over the bio for our first speaker, Special Agent Carlos Mitchell, and then the other two individuals, James Geldof and Michael Logue. We'll give you a brief bio about their background as well. But first, Carlos Mitchell. Carlos Mitchell II began his career in law enforcement as a police officer in Mount Prospect, Illinois in October of 1989. In February of 1991, Mr. Mitchell was hired by DEA and assigned to the Chicago Field Division as a criminal investigator. He worked in Chicago, Illinois until he was transferred to Hermosillo, Sonora, Mexico in September of 1995, where he worked as a criminal investigator throughout Sonora and Chihuahua, Mexico. In April of 1998, Mr. Mitchell was transferred to Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, Mexico, where DEA opened a new office and he worked as a criminal investigator. In July 2000, he was promoted and assigned to Tucson, Arizona District Office, where he served as a group supervisor. In August of 2003, he was reassigned as the Special Operations Division in Chantilly, Virginia, where he served as a staff coordinator in the methamphetamine section until he was transferred to Bogota, Colombia as a SOD staff coordinator. And then in April 2007, he was promoted and reassigned as the Assistant Regional Director for Mexico and based in Mexico City until 2011. In 2011, he was transferred to the Detroit Division Office and supervises 3 enforcement groups, 3, 4, and 5 in Detroit, as well as the Flint Resident Office and the Grand Rapids Resident Office, which includes the Marquette Post of Duty, Lansing Post of Duty, and the Kalamazoo Post of Duty. He has a Bachelor of Arts in Criminal Justice from Lewis University in Romeoville, Illinois. He has received numerous DEA awards as well as letters of appreciation from other U.S. law enforcement agencies. It's my proud honor and privilege to present to you Carlos Mitchell and his associates. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Thank you very much, Jerry. Thank you very much, Sarah. I appreciate everything. Thank you. I'm Carlos Mitchell. I'm Assistant Special Agent in charge of the DEA out of Detroit. And this February, I'll have 25 years with DEA. And in June, I'll have 5 years in Michigan. So hopefully I'll make it for another year. How can I? Let me just start out by saying the previous presenters, one exactly great point they made, consumption. Nothing I heard more in my 9 years of living and working in Mexico and my time in Bogota, Colombia was, why do Americans consume so many drugs? If Americans consume so many drugs, our countries wouldn't have the problems that we have. And I would hear that on a regular basis, nonstop. Besides, you know, why do we sell so many guns and bring so many guns into their countries? And with Mexico, constant reminder of the War of 1847, and we stole their land. So there's some things, you know, it says beat the drum, beat the drum. I can't do this, I have no idea how to do this. I'm sorry, I'm technically challenged with electronics. Okay, please. Okay. I only got 15 minutes because we're splitting it into threes today with Mr. Logan, Mr. Geldof, so if I could just go a little fast. I know I'm from Chicago, so don't take that against me, or hold it against me, and I do talk fast anyway. But what you look at in Mexico are pretty much 8 cartels. You're looking at, they're divided throughout the country, but the biggest cartel that you'll see here in Michigan is the Sinaloa cartel, which is Joaquin Guzman Loera, Chapo. He's the man, pretty much over there on the west part of the state, Sonora. Pretty much all the cartels got along when I was there in 95 to 2000. And then they worked together, and then with inner fighting and killing of each other's cartel members, because even though they're cartels, they have to pay tax to use certain port of entries to get into the United States. They have to pay tax to use certain part of the country. And so when fighting started between the cartels about paying taxes, then the major violence started right around 2004. In the upper left-hand corner, you'll see Tijuana, which is the border of San Diego. That used to be the Arellano Felix organization. No more, if they would have told me 20 years ago that that cartel would be gone, I never would believe it. There was 5 brothers. They were huge. They were very dangerous. They were extremely violent. But today, thanks to cooperation with the U.S. Law enforcement, the U.S. Attorney's Office, state and local prosecutors as well, and the Mexican government, they no longer exist. 1 is dead, 3 are in jail in the United States, and 1 is out of the business. But then that means the next cartel comes up, and then the Sinaloa cartel takes over the northwestern part of the country. You see their influence they have in the southern part, which goes right into Central America. When I started the DEA in '91 in Chicago, pretty much we were looking at Colombian cells. Colombian cells were all over the United States. Pretty much now you do not see Colombian cells, maybe in the Northeast, in Boston, New York, Philly, New Jersey, maybe Miami. But pretty much the Mexican cartels stopped at Chicago in the 90s. Mexican cartels are all throughout the United States now. They're all throughout Central America. They're in Colombia now as a base. They're in Europe now as their big point now because it's double the price of a kilo of cocaine. You can get a kilo of cocaine maybe in Detroit for $40,000. You go to Europe, it's $80,000. It's more profit. So they have expanded, and where the Colombians see extraditions, their country's law enforcement has taken a toll, and they take a step back, they get less profit, and they let the Mexicans take the frontal point of attack, if you want to say, or the pretty much more risk from law enforcement. Through information, state and local cooperation, through DEA information, through sources, through cases, through defendant briefings, we see where are the cells in the United States and what cartels pretty much have control of different areas throughout the United States. As you can see, the Sinaloa cartel is huge. They're all over. When I was in Mexico City, there was just 1 cell that we were looking at, twin brothers in Chicago. They were doing $6 million cash every single Monday from Chicago to Sinaloa on tractor trailers. Every Monday. 1 cell, 1 city out of 8 cartels. And the Sinaloa cartel had more cells throughout the United States. Here in Michigan, Mexican cells are here. They're here. There's direct contact to Mexico. There's no more the days where maybe Detroit cell would call Chicago or call Houston or call LA and then call Mexico. They're here. They're direct connects to Mexico, direct responses. You'll see the largest seizures that we've had so far in the last 5 years have been 104 kilos of cocaine driven by a 90-year-old white male, retired, was getting $1,000 a kilo. Very much of incentive for him to work and to drive. He would be getting a percentage of the money to drive it back to Mexico, and he was untouched for 15 years. Why do you see all the violence as well besides the inner fighting? You see the violence as well is because of enforcement actions. You know, when the new party came in the PRI in Mexico in 2007, $207 million seized out of Jin Yigon's house in Mexico City, Mexico. He was not one of your major cartel members. He was his own cartel, and all he did was sell pseudoephedrine to the cartels for $40,000 a kilo barrel, where he got it for $4,000 from China. So it's huge, huge profit. Through regulation was another great point that previous presenters made. Mexico had no regulation of pseudoephedrine. So Jin Yigon can order thousands and thousands and thousands of kilos of pseudoephedrine with no problem. Through regulation, through diversion investigators, changed the laws in Mexico, 0 importation. Then that moved and it changed to Central America, and each country in Central America spiked their importations of pseudoephedrine. The cartels, Sinaloa cartel is the #1 cartel, but they're all here. Michigan, we see the Zetas, we see the Gulf, and we see Chapo Guzman. This one, please. There's Chapo, top right, recently, and the bottom right as well, recently escaped from prison in Mexico. There's no shock, he escaped before. Traditionally, Mexican cartel members stay in Mexico, where the Colombian cartel members go to Panama, Venezuela, Ecuador, Brazil, and Bolivia, because they know of the legal judicial intercepts and the enforcement that the Colombians do. It's not safe for them to stay within Colombia, where the Mexicans will stay within Mexico. Very rarely do you see the heads leave Mexico. They're safe havens. There's corruption at all levels, state, local, federal, military as well, and it's frustrating. But you have to see, when I was working on, you try to work through your contacts, because some contacts you have will have alliance to one of the cartels. Next one, please. These are the Zetas. They used to be aligned with the Sinaloan cartel, but Miguel Ángel Trevino, Zeta 40, he killed one of Chapo Guzman's brothers. Chapo Guzman retaliated, kills one of his brothers, and they've been fighting ever since. But now Zeta 40 and Zeta 42, his brother Omar, they're in jail in Mexico, and now they're being led by somebody else. But those were one of the most violence in the northeast corner. They started out as protection for the Gulf cartel, and they realized how much money they can make being drug dealers instead of assassins and bodyguards, and they started their own cartel. Next one, please. The Gulf cartel, which used to be aligned with the Zetas, they are more in your northeast corner of Mexico. So the ports of entries are their safe areas where they're going to make it, and they want to control those and lay stake to those areas. So getting into Brownsville, Texas, getting up to McAllen, getting into different parts of Texas are extremely important. Where the Juarez cartel, I think, is the next one, would be important to get into El Paso because of the Interstate I-10. Here's the Juarez cartel. Vicente was recently arrested in Mexico. He had a little brother, Rodolfo, who was killed by Chapo because Chapo didn't want to pay taxes to get his dope through Chihuahua. The older brother was Amado Carrillo Fuentes, Lord of the Skies. His claim to fame was bringing 747 planes from Colombia to Mexico with tons and tons and tons of cocaine. As the previous presenters mentioned as well, now you see the ingenuity is amazing. Semi-submersible submarines, tractor trailers, trucks, body carriers, body swallowers, airplanes, every imaginable way to get drugs through Central America into Mexico, and tunnels up and down the southwest border are, it's amazing what they're able to create and how they're able to do this if they only used it for good things. Next one. These are one of the new cartels in Jalisco. In the center of the state is Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación. Their claim to fame is they had their own AR-15 gun ranch, so they can make their own weapons. La Familia Michoacana, their claim to fame was no drugs, no alcohol, but tried to poison America. They had their own guidebook. Poison America as much as they can. Send as much methamphetamine as you can to the United States to poison America. Heroin. I'm going to introduce Mike Logue. He's the field intelligence manager for Michigan, which also covers Kentucky and Ohio. I worked together with Mike in Colombia for several years. Mike was also in Turkey as well. And please, after the presentation, if you have any questions, we'd love to answer them. Thank you very much for your time.
I'd like to thank everybody again for inviting us. It's going to be kind of short for my presentation. I normally do this for 2 hours, so kind of compressing this into 50 minutes. So I do apologize if it's kind of rushed and spewed out real quickly. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. We'll try to get through as quickly as possible. Once Mr. Geldof does his presentation, I understand we have a question and answer. So if you have any questions that we don't get to, please feel free to ask us at that time. Okay, so every year the DEA puts out what's called the National Drug Threat Survey. It goes out to state and local police officers and sheriff's departments throughout the United States, basically asking them, what are your threats? And as you see over the years, heroin has obviously become a greater and greater threat throughout the country, especially within our part of the United States. Heroin has always been a high threat within the Northeast. It's becoming more and more within the Great Lakes area. If you look at the rest of the country, their primary threat right now is methamphetamine being produced out of Mexico. So this is based off of heroin seizures that are done throughout the country. Clearly, there's more and more being seized every year. It's not necessarily an indicator of consumption, but it's what we're seeing when we're seizing stuff. So there's more and more coming into the country. And this includes both Mexican brown, Mexican black tar, and Colombian white. This is kind of shows the change over time, the threats of heroin within a particular region. Obviously in the Northeast, it's always been very high. Here in the Great Lakes area, it's been steadily increasing. Throughout the rest of the country, again, most of the threat to those areas of methamphetamine, however, we're seeing a lot more popping up in the Northwest. So what is the reason why we're seeing more and more heroin being consumed? A lot of it has to do with the opioid prescription drugs. A lot of folks nowadays, and it's been increasing throughout the years, start off their addiction with prescription opioid drugs, mainly because they don't want to have that stigma of being a junkie, a guy with found dead with a needle in his arm. Start off with the prescription drugs. It's good because it's clean, it's coming from a pharmacy, but after a while their addiction increases, it becomes more expensive, they're not getting the high that they can anymore, and so they switch over to the heroin. So this kind of shows first-time users what drug they start off with. Either it's straight heroin or they start off with the prescription drugs. And obviously back in the 60s, there really weren't that many prescription opioids. So the vast majority of people were starting off with heroin, but over the years, starting their first encounter with opioid drugs has been with the prescription drugs. There does appear to be a decline with this last 10 years. However, this data isn't necessarily complete. We still haven't gotten any data from 2014 and 2015, so that may pop back up again. This is a number of estimated heroin users. Again, we see an increase throughout the United States. Slight drop in 2013, but again, we don't have any statistical data yet for 2014, 2015. This is what catches everybody's attention. This is the overdose deaths of heroin throughout the years. That little spike on the end has gotten a lot of people's attention. Again, one of the big problems we have with people who are addicted to these drugs, they start off with the prescription drugs, jump over to straight heroin, where there really is no control of dosages. They don't know what they're taking at a time. Purity of heroin on the street can range anywhere from 8% to 80%. So if you get a hot load one day, it's going to kill you. There's another reason why we might see the spike, which I'll go to a little bit later on. Yeah, I'm not going to go through this. It's great. The country's pretty much divided as far as the preference of the type of heroin. In the western part of the Mississippi, side of the Mississippi, you see primarily brown Mexican or black tar, and on the eastern part of the country, it's always been white powder. Originally, that white powder was coming from Southeast or Southwest Asia, but since 1997, the Colombians had started producing their own white heroin and basically pushed Southwest and Southeast Asian heroin out of the market. They already had pre-established trafficking cells that were selling cocaine and marijuana, and they used good marketing tools, provided free samples, and they undersold the other dealers. So pretty much, we hardly see any Southwest or Southeast Asian heroin in the United States anymore. It's all coming from Colombia. Let me just go back. One thing we have noticed within the last 3 years is we have a program called the Heroin Signature Program, where we get samples throughout the country from undercover buys. We send them to our special testing laboratory, and we have means of determining where it was produced, by the methods and as far as the remaining substances, or the impurities that are in there. We started seeing samples about 3 years ago that looked like Colombian heroin, but it didn't exactly match the signature. Just this last year, we've identified it's actually Mexican white heroin, which they never had done before. And particularly in our part of the world, we're seeing almost half of our white heroin samples have this Mexican signature. So the Mexicans are now producing white heroin. Here we have some drug treatment statistics here from Michigan. I'm sorry, we don't have any stats for Jackson County. But since 2010, 2011, we have seen an increase of people that are going to clinics for treatment for heroin addiction. Fentanyl is a serious issue right now. Back in 2005 to 2007, there was an epidemic throughout the country where we had somewhere around 1,200 people overdosing on fentanyl. Fentanyl is very similar to heroin, however, it's 25 to 40 times more potent. Just to use an example, a single grain of table salt is enough for a hardcore heroin user to get a good high off of. 2 grains of salt would kill them straight out. It's that powerful. It's a huge risk for law enforcement people out there because there's really no good way of identifying it visually. You get it on your skin, they're going to overdose on it. So basically, we have to start handling a lot of our drugs out in the field with gloves. And unfortunately, fentanyl, when we use our field drug tests, shows as cocaine because there's no particular test for fentanyl that can be used out in the field. So you're getting a false positive for cocaine. The only time we can actually identify it as fentanyl is if we send it to our special research laboratory and they do their high-speed tests on them. One of the issues, again, we're starting to see this pop up in the United States again. It's been going on for about 3 years. The previous epidemic that we had was identified to a single laboratory that was producing it clandestinely in Mexico with chemicals that were coming from China. This time around, they've been a little bit more smarter. The previous time, they were not cutting the fentanyl enough. It was so strong that, again, you could put a small amount and mix it with the heroin, which is what they typically do, and it was so much that it was just killing people straight out. They're being a little bit more careful this time around. They're diluting it more. However, we're seeing, an increasing number of deaths. We haven't been able to identify who's producing it this time around. There were 4 or 5 individuals that were associated with the lab in Mexico who were not captured, so they might have started to pick up the business again. And in a lot of cases that when we've done interviews of drug users and of drug dealers that are selling, oftentimes they don't even know they're selling fentanyl or even using fentanyl. So it's a mixed bag. It's hard to determine at what stage the fentanyl is being introduced into the market. We haven't gotten there yet. It's been only going on about 3 years. But we've already seen a lot of overdose. The Detroit Field Division did a study specifically on fentanyl throughout the country. The states that are red here are ones that have been identified where there were definitely overdose deaths of fentanyl. During that time period, the time period covered 2014, we had identified approximately 700 people who had overdosed with fentanyl. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to get a good number because most toxicology screenings don't test for fentanyl. It metabolizes in the body, and your typical tox screening will actually have it show up as morphine. You have to specifically test for the fentanyl in order to determine what it is. Now, that 700 figure that we came up with was a preliminary based off of anecdotal data, some of our DEA reports, some local PD reports. The state of Ohio did their own study where they actually were testing for fentanyl, and during that same time period, they identified 500 alone in Ohio who overdosed on fentanyl. So that 700 number has been blown totally out of the water. I'm sure it's a lot more. This was a study we did just in the city of Detroit of fentanyl overdoses. 2015 is only the first 3 months of 2015. So if you multiply that 4 times, it's probably going to be somewhere up here. That's just Detroit. So the spike that we talked about with the heroin overdoses, we have a strong suspicion this is tied to fentanyl, but we just don't know. Unfortunately, there's no standardized screening test for fentanyl. It's not typically tested for, so unless you know to look for it, you're not going to find it. Okay, I'm just going to go quickly over this because Mr. Geldof's probably going to talk about some of this. Controlled prescription drugs, specifically on opioids. We're talking about the overdose deaths. We were just talking about heroin. This is heroin down here with the spike. The blue line is cocaine. This red line way up here is CPD overdoses. It's more than the two combined together. So yeah, we're focusing a lot on heroin, but CPDs are a serious, serious problem, and we can't ignore them. So how are they getting these drugs? The vast majority of them are getting them free from, getting them free from a friend or relative, or purchased from a friend or relative, basically the Friends and Family Program. DEA focuses a lot on the One Doc Shop program. So when we see this huge number down here, well, where are the friends and family getting it from? You start examining those a little more deeper, and they're doing doc shopping. So basically, this pie chart 75% of them are getting them from dock shopping. And as was described earlier, these dock shops are pretty blatant. I was shown a video a while back of surveillance that was done down in Florida where they really started looking at this stuff. It was a small, manufactured building kind of in a parking lot. I believe it was a women's health clinic. And you had this line of really sketchy guys going all the way around the block with guys walking around with guns. Kind of obvious, but they had a licensed doctor. They basically put an ad in Craigslist and found he was like an 80-year-old guy who had retired, still had his license. They'd send a van to his house every morning, wheel him into the shop. They'd have somebody doing an examination of the individual. Your back hurts, right? Yeah, your back hurts. You need this amount of drugs. They'd write it up, send it over to the doctor, he'd sign it. It was just assembly line. Happens all over the place. So one of the things we kind of look at, one of the two of the ones that seem to be abused the most are the hydrocodone and oxycodone. We did a quick study just to kind of look at sales and sales per capita throughout the United States. So the top two orange maps are hydrocodone. The bottom ones in the green are oxycodone. The right-hand side are the raw sales in units, and the left-hand side is units per capita. So if you look at Michigan for the oxycodone, we're kind of in the middle, but when you look at that per capita, we're in the deep red, which means that there's a potential higher availability of hydrocodone within the state. It doesn't necessarily say that it's all being abused, but it's there if that potentiality is there. Oxycodone, Michigan is pretty much in the middle and below average when it comes to the per capita, so it doesn't appear to be that is a potential problem as much in other states. But it could also be an effect of how much the drugs cost in a country. So they may be buying it in one state and selling it in another state. That's something we really haven't delved into yet. Opiate drug treatment statistics, this to me is kind of surprising. It seems to be that either relatively stable or going down. But again, we don't really have a broad look at the entire state or even the entire country because getting those kind of statistics are very difficult for us to get. Methamphetamine, real quickly on this. Again, most of the rest of the country, methamphetamine is a serious problem. The vast majority of the methamphetamine they're seeing is being produced in Mexico in bulk quantities. Yes, it is up here in the Great Lakes area, but from what we have seen, the vast majority of it is the one pot, shake and bake type, where we're basically making 2 or 3 grams at a time, not bulk quantities. However, we have seen in cases in Kentucky and Ohio where Mexican heroin traffickers who are trafficking anywhere from 5 to 10 kilos a month, they're now carrying along an extra kilo of methamphetamine and trying to get those dealers down there to start selling it. So they are making inroads into our area. It's possible we might see it start popping up here in the Michigan area. We just don't know at this stage. Don't need to talk about that. Again, the vast majority of the methamphetamine that's coming to the United States is coming from Mexico. This is seizure data. You look at San Diego, 6.7 tons of methamphetamine. So the vast majority of the methamphetamine is coming from the Sinaloa cartel as well as the Gulf cartel. Cocaine, real quick. Crazy, non-understandable chart. Basically, all that means is that the cocaine situation appears to be on a decline throughout the country. And now, obviously, there's going to be hot spots where it's still a preferred drug, but nationwide, it seems to be declining. The vast majority of the cocaine is coming from Colombia. There's 3 primary countries that produce cocaine: Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru. It used to be a fairly equal spread throughout the United States. However, now Colombians pretty much dominate, with the remaining 10% coming out of Peru. Bolivia stopped sending their cocaine to us. I guess they don't like us that much anymore. The majority of their cocaine is either going to Europe, where again they can get much more for it, or it's even starting to go to Australia into the Far East. Synthetic drugs. You got your bath salts and your spice has become a situation throughout the country. You are seeing people overdose on it. It's causing a lot of psychosis problems. You probably remember the naked guy who was trying to eat the guy's face off. That's why they started calling it the zombie drug. We have had some overdoses in Michigan on the spice, on the cannabinoids. I always have a hard time saying that. They're basically mixing it with their e-cigarettes, and if they're not very careful on the dosages, it's way too much, or it doesn't really mix well with the solution, so you get hot spots. So if they don't shake it really well and they take a hit off of it, they're getting the pure drug as opposed to getting a mixture of other stuff. That's all I have. Any, okay.
My name's Jim Geldof. I'm the Diversion Program Manager in Detroit Field Division. We cover 3 states, as they said, Ohio, Michigan, and Kentucky. I will be the Program Manager for, I'll put this in here, about another 3 weeks. I'll be retiring after about 43 years with DEA. So this will be the last day. Thank you. It'll be the last day I'm wearing a suit. As my buddy said, just make sure you can find one that you look horizontally good in, so hopefully that won't be for a while. I'm an old guy, so old guys, first of all, don't use computers, things along those lines, real well. But what I thought I would do is kind of give you an overview of how prescription drugs got to be where they're at. I think a lot of people have come to the game in the bottom of the 8th inning, and I guess it's better than not coming at all. But I think that I think people need to understand exactly how this whole situation developed. As Dave said before, there was a perfect storm. There were some other things involved that I want to go into real quick. I've got 15 minutes. It'll be down and dirty. We'll be around for questions after. First of all, this particular division has been just basically ravaged by prescription drug abuse. Right now, Kentucky is number 2 in the country in overdose deaths. Ohio is 8th. Michigan, I believe, the last figures I saw was 18th. And West Virginia borders our division and shares a lot of the same situations with Kentucky and Ohio. They're number 1 in the country in overdose deaths. If you want to see what prescription drug abuse can do to a community, Google Oceana, West Virginia, also known as Oxiana, West Virginia. They did a documentary on that town about a couple of years ago. And one kid is quoted as, I think he graduated from high school in 2005 or 2006. Half of his high school graduating class is dead from prescription drug abuse overdoses. Another one you might want to look at is Portsmouth, Ohio, which is a tragedy, but also is probably the proudest I've been of our operation. Portsmouth, a town on the Ohio River, right across from Kentucky, absolutely ravaged by oxycodone and OxyContin. At one point in time, a town of about 75,000 people, there was probably 15 pain clinics, most of them owned by drug felons. A couple of doctors that were off the grid on what they were dispensing and prescribing. One guy, Paul Volkman, was convicted a couple years ago. He got 4 life sentences. When we charged him, he was charged with 11 overdose deaths. We had him involved, we feel, in about 30 overdose deaths. And when I give these presentations to doctors, I think there's a lot of anecdotal information out there that DEA's out there putting doctors in jackpots because they wrote for 60 Vicodin instead of 30, which couldn't be further from the truth. When we look at the kind of cases we're involved in, Dave mentioned the guy from Hamtramck. These are people that Volkman probably in his heyday he was the largest dispenser in the country. And he was replaced after he was indicted by a Margie Tempenaris, who we just indicted in June. She was in a town of Wheelersburg, Ohio, town of about 5,000 people. She was dispensing well over 2 million pills a year. Now, that's second in the United States in Wheelersburg, Ohio. So, you know, we're talking pretty bad abuse. If you want to know what a community can do, what they did down in Portsmouth, Lisa Russell is a nurse who's with the Department of Health down there. Her group absolutely shined a spotlight on the problem. If it wasn't for them putting pressure on legislators, putting pressure on law enforcement, the cases may have been made, but have been a lot longer. She really, I mean, they were meeting with the governor's office, they were meeting with local politicians, local legislators, law enforcement, and really shining a light on how bad it was. And I will tell you this, I went to a meeting similar to this. We had a roundup down there in 2011. We indicted a bunch of doctors, pharmacists, pulled DEA registrations. About a week later, they had a town hall meeting. And they had the police chief, had a slideshow like that, and he had every kid that had overdosed on pills or who had died of violence associated with that, their high school graduation picture or something along those lines up on the screen. The whole place was dark, and all you could hear, they had a community group, it was called So Sad, I believe was the acronym, and all you could hear was sobbing and people crying. And I'll never forget that, probably as long as I live. You know, with DEA, we think of arrest stats and seizure stats and, you know, things like that. But when you go to a meeting and you see the impact that that has on families, it really brings, theoretically, what we're supposed to be doing home. So I want to tell you, you know, people have been talking about community involvement. It's huge. It makes a difference. Believe me, it does. So what you're doing here is really the right thing. Okay, so that's kind of war stories a little bit of where we're at. I want to kind of give you an idea of how we got there. And I'll go quickly. I'm not going to, old guys go down memory lane, so we'll do that a little bit, but we'll go quick. First time I saw prescription drug abuse in relation to heroin was 1979 or 1980. I was stationed in New Jersey. In Hudson County, New Jersey, there was about 15 overdose deaths of Tylenol with codeine, number 4, in combination with Dortin. That's a drug that's no longer made. It's a tranquilizer, hypnotic type drug. And they called it fours and doors, hits, loads. We'd go down Bloomfield Avenue and you'd see guys on the corner doing this, and that was that they had hits for sale. And the addicts would take 2 Tylenol with codeine with Dortin as a combination. Anybody have an idea what was happening in 1979, 1980 that would have prompted that kind of AIDS? And a lot of the addicts didn't want to be, you know, worried about dirty needles, so they wanted a heroin substitute that would get them that high. And that's the first time I saw pills in relationship to heroin. That was 79. I transferred to Detroit in 86, and I can tell you, I have never, New York and New Jersey are not small towns, but I had never seen diversion like I saw in Detroit in the 80s. Dilaudid, which was, there was no really long-acting narcotics at the time, so the main drug of choice was Dilaudid. It was selling for $50 a pill in the Cass Corridor. Again, because there was no long-acting Dilaudid, or no long-acting narcotics, if you had a real painful cancer, all you could do is really stack up the Dilaudid. But, I mean, the diversion was off the charts here in Detroit. It was, in fact, I have a headline out of the Free Press of 1984, back in my office, and it said, Michigan is to the abuse of prescription drugs what Miami is to cocaine. And that was the days of the cocaine cowboys and things like that. So it's been around a long time. Now, don't get me wrong, it's taken off big time in the last 10 years. But this area has always been a hotbed for pills and prescription drug abuse. Because of a couple of things that happened, we made some significant cases, but the state also passed some really terrific legislation. They banned some drugs from being prescribed. Proludin, which was a methamphetamine drug, very, very popular. The state banned that from being prescribed. They also passed a multiple copy prescription law, which meant that all Schedule II drug prescriptions had to be basically sent by the state to the doctors, and they had to use those prescriptions to write on. That basically eliminated forged prescriptions from the arena. There was a sunset provision on that legislation. It expired, I think it was 2000, something like that. Tom, you probably know the date of MAPS better than I do. But basically, it wasn't renewed, and that's how MAPS came into play. The multiple copy script law went away, and MAPS was kind of a trade-off, so that's how the MAPS program came into play. Schedule II drugs were pretty much down for quite a while. And in the mid-1990s, a couple things happened. Number one, the country's views on pain management changed dramatically. And I'm going to read this to you. Anybody wants to look up this article, it's the December 14th, 12. I didn't keep the copy of this second part of it. It's Pain Drug Champion has second thoughts, and the doctor's name is Russell Portnoy. And here's one of the comments he makes. Did I teach about pain management, specifically about opioid therapy, in a way that reflects misinformation? Well, against the standards of 2012, I guess I did. He goes on to indicate that their view at the time was no more than 1% of people could get addicted to these drugs, and they were very safe, and just throw the drugs at the patient, very safe, not a problem. One of the things that goes on in that article is when Dr. Portnoy was making those comments, which he has obviously walked back now, 10 or 15 years later, he was a consultant to Purdue Pharma and a few other ones, but Purdue Pharma was the main one. In conjunction with the views on pain that was going on in the country, OxyContin gets manufactured and marketed. When it came out initially, it was supposed to be for moderate to severe pain. In its heyday, over 50% of the scripts that were being written for OxyContin were by primary care physicians. So that tells you a lot right there as far as the marketing of that drug and how it was really handled. Now, later on, after they established the market and the abuse is off the charts, they reformulated the drug, which I'll go into in a second, and what came after that. Another thing that was happening a little bit later than that was the internet pharmacy situation. My personal opinion, that had the biggest effect on prescription drugs of anything going on. I don't know if anybody's aware of what the internet pharmacies were. The cornerstone to any proper prescribing of controlled drugs is an effective doctor-patient relationship. Internet pharmacies involve basically Vicodin, Xanax, Valium, and what would happen is you would get on a website and the doctor would send you a questionnaire. What's your pain level 1 through 10? Everybody had a 10, obviously. He'd go ahead and fax that over to a pharmacy. The pharmacy would FedEx the pills over to the patient. Patient never saw the doctor. Doctor never saw the pharmacy. Patients in Michigan, pharmacies in Florida. Two primary places were Florida and Texas. Pharmacies in Florida and the doctors in Puerto Rico. Now what happens? You've got kids in college. All you need is a credit card. You have a credit card, you're going to get those drugs. And I think that was the first opening for a lot of kids into prescription drug abuse. And the way that ended, we put an end to internet pharmacies, but it took a while, is basically putting pressure on the drug companies. I'm not the sharpest guy in the world, but when you've got a pharmacy buying basically 10 million Vicodin, another X amount of million Xanax, Viagra, and nothing else, I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out probably it's not operating legally. So you had these internet pharmacies that were going on. That finally comes to an end probably around 2003, 2004, and that's when the pain clinics in Florida pick up. And I give you an example of how the distribution, Mike talked a little bit about the distribution. There were times in 2008, 2009, when drug companies were sending more oxycodone 30s, which replaced the OxyContin, more oxycodone 30s to Florida than they were to the rest of the United States monthly. Okay, and that went on for about 2 to 3 years. That started the Oxy Express. A lot of people from this area, Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky, were going down to Florida to get their oxycodone. OxyContin, I forgot to mention, at the time of their heyday in eastern Kentucky, an OxyContin 80 milligram tablet was selling for $120. So if you got a script for 100 OxyContin, that script was worth $12,000 in eastern Kentucky. So that's the kind of money that was involved. People were supporting themselves down there in these areas that basically they didn't have a whole lot else. But that's the kind of money that was involved in this. As a result, we've really put a lot of pressure on the drug companies. We put 2 or 3 of them out of business. We had a couple of wholesalers in Cincinnati that probably in 2006, 2007 were selling 20,000 oxycodone pills to the state of Florida. 2 years later, they were selling 42 million to the state of Florida. So there's a lot of blame to go around. But one of the things we're really, really emphasizing is the pharmaceutical companies being partners with us. Mike and Carlos didn't go into it, but we don't lose a lot of doctor and pharmacy cases, and that's not because we're the best and the brightest. It's because we have to jump through a lot of hoops to make a case on a doctor. Soup to nuts on a doctor case, you're looking at well over a year generally. So while we're working 2 or 3 cases, Dave's group's working cases, you've got pharmaceutical companies just shipping this stuff in, and you're just you're chasing your tail. And so they have to, buy in and be our partners on this thing to really have a dent, and that's what we're hoping to encourage. I think that it seems to me that I think things are stabilizing a little bit with the prescription drug abuse. I'm hearing good things. Somebody mentioned the president was out in West Virginia drawing attention to it. I know he's encouraging more Suboxone treatment available to people, which I think is a very good thing. Before you had Suboxone, if you were hooked on Vicodin, your only option was methadone, which is kind of crazy to go up in standard to get drug treatment. But I think we're encouraged by that. State of Michigan, other states, Ohio has been tremendous in their efforts. Governor Kasich has been great. So I'm really encouraged by legislation. And again, I'm just going to close with this because I don't want to take up anybody's time or the questions. Believe me when I tell you these community groups are important. They make a difference. It's a big deal. Don't think you don't. And just, I hope when I retire that I'm going to be involved with some of this stuff. But I thank you for your efforts and keep up the good work. So thank you.